Hello, my name is Christopher Doyle, and I am a Gen X pastor in the PCUSA. And I'm speaking today from the sanctuary of one of the two churches I'm currently serving because my dissertation speaks specifically about the future of the churches that we all love and cherish. Before attending seminary at UD in 2006, I lived and worked in the Middle East in various church positions in education, educational administration, and in refugee development. Most of that time was spent in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and it was in Bethlehem where I met my wife of now 26 years and where we married and started our family. We have two sons. In 2005, we arrived in the United States to Dubuque, Iowa, where I attended UD Seminary, graduating in 2009. While I was a student at UD, I took the position of student pastor at a couple small rural churches southwest of Dubuque. There were older congregations with no children beside our boys, and there was also no one there from my own generational cohort. And so it was at that point that I really started to see and think about the lack of Gen X participation in the church and how the long-range consequences to the church were going to be negative if this wasn't some way addressed. My first call to ordained ministry was to a church in southern New Jersey. So in October of 2011, my family and I, we made our way from Iowa to New Jersey. And once again, there were few kids and hardly anyone from my own generational cohort. I then began the DMin program through the University of Dubuque, and it became apparent that it was through this program that some of the questions in my mind about the lack of Generation X participation in the church could be addressed. I should note that since beginning the program, I accepted a new call to northern New Jersey, where the same situation of a lack of kids and Generation X folk is the case. To complete my DMin program for my dissertation, I chose to look at this issue that had been on my mind now for more than a handful of years, and decided to have as the foundation of this project a series of interviews with Gen Xers about their experiences with the church. Because I had worked with oral history previously, I knew that to write this story, the oral history approach would make the most sense, but that to take the story broader in scope, I would also have to create a survey that would accompany those interviews, along with standard academic research on the subject that would have to be done. Getting started, I sat down with a number of people from my cohort who were close by. There were some who were church active, but many who were not. From those interviews, I then formulated a 28-question survey using SurveyMonkey so that it would be easier to keep track of and collate the results. To get Gen X folks to fill out the survey, I traveled all over the state of New Jersey to various regional church meetings and other groups, presented my project, and then asked for those who fit the parameters of the research to fill out the survey and to have others they knew, church active and inactive, fill it out as well. I was also able to connect with Gen Xers that I had known growing up just north of New York City, and also with some I had been in my undergraduate program on Long Island with who were still in the New York City, New Jersey area. From standard informational research, sit-down interviews, and from the survey results, I put together my dissertation, which is entitled Responding Faithfully to Generation X, Why Generation X Rejected the Church en masse, What It Means to the Future of the Church, and what we can do about it. In organizing the writing of the story I wanted to tell, I first needed to establish who and what Generation X is, who we are, and what we're known for, what the historical background of our story is, and how we formed into the adults we've become. This led to a few main areas of focus. First, we were mainly raised by early baby boomers and or later silent generation folks who had also grown up in the church and saw it as an important part of their childhoods, but not so important for their adulthoods. Our parents' priorities were more often than not focused on making money and bringing to our households the things that they saw themselves as lacking during their own formative years, or the things that society was telling them that they needed. In the survey results for the project, only about half of the respondents answered that both parents had been involved with the church when they were growing up. Many Gen X parents would gladly drop us off at church on Sunday mornings and to youth group activities throughout the week, but often didn't participate themselves, or only half-heartedly did so. Children most often learn by example, we know that, And their example here was not always the best when it came to relationship with the church. Added to that, for many, church was still more of a social function than a real prescription for spiritual health. And so for many, social relationships outside the church were easier to create, build, and sustain, as well as oftentimes found to be more appealing. Looking at statistics from the Presbyterian Church itself, they show that only about 14% of the national membership registers as Generation X. 65% is over the age of 58, with the remaining 21% as millennial, or the newest generation known as Generation Z. Yet at the same time, through the survey results, it was also seen that 88% of those who responded do believe in God. This in particular is good news for the church because it shows that Generation X in New Jersey and its environs have not rejected God. However, this number does also bring out some bad news, obviously, for the church. Even though they believe in God, Generation X has overwhelmingly rejected the church. And this is the trend across denominational lines. Without a major effort of outreach, the future of the church is going to look much different than it has in the past. Connected to this question, another question showed that only 8% of respondents had no church foundations in their formative years, and that 69% declare themselves to be spiritually hungry. Once again, there is good news here for the church in that those church foundations are there. The church is not something which is foreign to Generation X. And with 65% of them admitting spiritual hunger, this tells us that this field may very well be ripe for development if the churches can learn to reach out to and connect with Generation X in a way that draws them back. Second, for the majority of us, our most foundational years took place during the 1980s when political, social, and technological changes were happening so rapidly that it was difficult to make sense of them sometimes. For instance, with the election of Ronald Reagan, the new ideological shift that began focused on the notion that if the government aided big business, that their prosperity would then filter down to the masses. A big part of that approach began with the slashing of tax rates from corporations and wealthy individuals, which did cause a very short-term boom to the economy, but never really translated into the lower economic classes being able to pull themselves up from where they'd been. On top of that, the government of the 1980s felt compelled to finally win the Cold War with Russia that had been raging for decades. Defense spending was massively increased, which, when coupled with slashed tax rates, caused a drastic loss in government revenues. To deal with that situation, the government then cut social welfare and educational spending, and even borrowed massive amounts of money from the Social Security Fund with no plan to pay it back, which is why it's thought to be in danger today. It was also in the 1980s in which government policies began encouraging globalization in earnest, which resulted in a plethora of new and familiar products suddenly being available to us, which in turn spurred on a new sense of materialism. That helped to spur on the bringing into our homes of computers as a standard necessity, which in turn helped to open the world to us like it had never been opened before. Also helping in that effort was the development of cable television. Now, how cable television directly affected our relationship with the church is tied to the beginning of a plethora of evangelical Christian broadcasting, which was the basis of the growth of U.S. evangelicalism. In the survey conducted, just over 80% of those polled answered that they saw the televangelists at the time, or of that time, as complete scam artists, while just about 60% claimed that those personalities had led them to having an overall negative view of the church. People like Oral Roberts, Jerry Falwell, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, and some others have all been ministering in their circles for years, but with cable television, their brand of Christianity was now suddenly coming into our living rooms. Their approach being so different and frankly rather divisive had many of us Gen Xers scratching our heads exactly because it was so different from what we'd known of the church. We began asking, if this is the direction of the church and the direction that it's taking, do we really want to be tied to that? The scandals that followed from those personalities only then helped to strengthen a sense of distrust of the church and their aims that was already present in society from the boomer generation. The sex scandals of the Catholic Church in the 1990s only then cemented that sense into many of the minds of Generation X and beyond. And third, another big part of the Generation X story and its rejection of the church came directly from the educations that we were receiving. The development of the sciences in the 1970s and 80s, coupled with a differing attitude of educational priorities, were contradicting much of what we were being taught in the church. For instance, does life as we know it get its start from the Big Bang Theory? Or was it the 6 days that God took to create the universe, with the final task being God's creation of Adam and Eve? Newer developments in the fields of psychology and sociology, as well as a more honest approach toward history, added to that sense immensely as well. When asked in the survey about any negative results of the historical church, most all of the respondents supplied comments that focused on the countless deaths from wars the church had either started and carried out or supported, their support of the slave trade, the destruction of other peoples during the years when Europeans were colonizing the world with priests beside them demanding the conversion to Christianity of the world's heathens, or the social ostracizing of certain groups, and the church's historical attitude toward women and children. On top of all of that, there also came about for Generation X a new attitude toward issues of social acceptance, which were in part spurred on from the educations we were receiving, but was especially brought on by the AIDS crisis that frightened the entire nation during the 1980s. But then started Generation Xers also wondering why society and the church felt so compelled to reject those who were coming out of their proverbial closets in a way that seemed so against the love Jesus Christ had exemplified. I should note here that social acceptance was not just about the questions surrounding sexual orientation, but also questions surrounding race, ethnicity, and economic class. Acceptance of those who were labeled as different was becoming standard in Generation X minds, which then, to them, showed the church to be horribly hypocritical. In fact, in the survey for this study, 94% of respondents said that they feel the church is filled with hypocrisy. So, as a result of new government policies, the development of globalization and new technologies, the popularity of cable television, and a changing educational and social experience, Generation X came to realize that if they were going to be able to do anything with their lives, that they would have to make it all happen for themselves. We became known as really independent, creative, resilient, and unencumbered by the expectations of society or of our parents. And for most, the church didn't fit into where we saw our lives going. Now, I present that this is the basis of the Generation X story and the church, and at the very heart of why so many of us have walked away. Generation X has often felt that their experience, their needs, and their wants for the church were never approached by the church as a serious concern. In the survey, just about half responded that they don't believe that Generation X needs were ever met by the church, while another quarter of those responding answered that they weren't really sure how to answer the question. This is in part because it's seen by Gen Xers that the church and its leadership have been focusing on the experiences and needs of the baby boomer generation, which was and still is dominant in the church. But then also in part because, like so many other segments of U.S. society, the next big focus after the boomers became the millennials. Generation X essentially got skipped over, and as a final result, they become famously labeled as spiritual but not religious. Spiritual because they do desire a relationship with God, but not religious because they associate religion with the church. Drawing scripture into this story, I looked at how humanity has often responded to their life experiences with the standard formats of religious belief being something that seemed almost foreign to them and therefore have come up with their own solutions. Specifically, I looked into the book of Judges, which begins and ends with the notion that because the Israelites had no king, they did what was right in their own eyes. I also looked at the experience of David as king with God, who often had a very contentious relationship with God. I then matched that experience with the people of Corinth as written about by Paul in his first letter to the people there. I also then included the views of some of our Christian traditions, theological heavyweights, and looked at how they believe that God can be at the center of how we live our lives here in this realm. And then finally, I outlined 7 ways for churches to tackle this issue that we're all facing. These are mostly coming directly from sit-down interviews and survey results. First, gain understanding. Churches need to learn about the Generation X experience so that then when they hopefully and eventually have conversations with them, there will be a basis of understanding. Generation X does desire to be reached out to, but they don't really want to have to teach potential congregations about why they had walked away to begin with. Second, Generation X task forces. This is something that can be done at every level of the church and really should be. But the church has to get in touch with not only the few Generation X folks that they have, but they have to reach out beyond them and discover what Generation X feels that their needs are. Perhaps in a specific locale, there's a deep concern within this age group that the church can try to address. It may be within the walls of the church or outside. Third, teach about the good that the church is already doing. The church has changed immensely for the better in the last 30 years plus. But even a lot of the folks in our pews regularly are not aware of much of it. The church must do a better job at teaching about all of the good that is happening in the church on local, regional, national, and international levels. There's a lot out there that's being done, which is not only good but great. And the occasional missionary coming in to do a minute for mission or even leading worship will never be enough. Fourth, solid biblical preaching. Generation X, as many others, want to know why and how the scriptures can speak to our lives in real ways and address the concerns that they have. Generally speaking, they're not really interested in hearing sermons based on books other than the Bible or sermons that try to relate the Bible to current events. Preaching is for sure the most difficult job of the pastor, but it's one that must be taken very seriously if Generation X is going to be engaged. Fifth, teaching community. We often think that our congregations are friendly meetup spots where we come to learn and fellowship together around something bigger than ourselves. But we have to become better at actually teaching community and what that means. Is your church a real inclusive and welcoming community, or more the opposite? As a pastor, I've seen both types, while all claim to be friendly and welcoming. What does your church do for the community it lives in? And would your church be missed if it were to move its location? Sixth, focused programming. Gen Xers are living really busy lives, still caring for their children, and sometimes for their grandchildren, and sometimes for their own parents as well. They want and desire programming that doesn't require the entire blocking out of a whole day or evening on their calendars. Because of the pandemic, many of our churches and most people have become really familiar with virtual meetups like with Zoom. Bible studies, book groups, or other groups meeting virtually are really good for Gen Xers because they can organize themselves for an hour or two in the evening on their computers before having to dash off and get to the next thing on their list of things to do done. And seventh, church leadership. A very high percentage of Gen Xers in the interviews and survey noted that they didn't feel church leadership had been well trained enough by their denominational traditions to really address the forms of ministry and ministering that they were looking for. The responsibility for this falls mainly on the desks of denominational leadership, but can also be taken up by pastors and elders in individual churches. Leadership is always key and should always be continuing their educations if they want to remain relevant and ready for the challenges that the church so often brings. Generation X, in many instances, are eager to re-engage with the church. but they're waiting to be invited into a place that is willing and able to address their needs and their viewpoints. I believe that that is the story that I have presented in my dissertation. My presentation is probably now a little bit longer than it should be, but this subject is a big one and one that needs continuous effort. For the future of the church may very well depend on it. God bless, and may we all go forth to serve the Lord and each other.